Maggie listened to Ben's steps. It seemed to the woman that in another minute he would find her to hurt her. Maggie was afraid of pain, but Ben himself was much worse. His bloodshot eyes and frantic gaze made the woman faint. Her hands became cold as ice. Maggie could not understand when family violence began between her and Ben. They met when they were 15 years old. Maggie was transferred to Ben's school because she wanted to study art history and devote herself entirely to this activity. Ben, on the other hand, never wanted to understand that Homer and Achilles were not Renaissance artists at all. The guy was not very smart, but he was popular among his peers. Ben was a tall, strong athlete with a charming white-toothed smile and a perky personality, which is why almost all the girls at school fell in love with him. Ben immediately noticed the new girl. Maggie was short and slender, with large blue eyes and dark curly hair that soon became the object of envy of the other girls. Grace, who was previously considered the first beauty of the school, always dreamed of girls like Maggie's. Therefore, the appearance of a competitor with a perfect hairstyle outraged everyone's favorite. Grace tried to humiliate Maggie, but Ben did not allow her to do so. This was enough for Grace to hate Maggie and start saying nasty things about her at every opportunity. But Maggie did not pay attention to such attacks. She felt good next to Ben, who seemed to her to be the best guy in the world. He was very nice to her, caring, and tried to entertain the girl when she was in a bad mood. At the prom, Ben and Maggie were chosen as prom king and queen. Grace ran away crying when she realized that upstart Maggie Roberts was the best again. However, no one paid attention to the tears of the former first beauty. All the participants of the festive party had as much fun as they could. Maggie went for a ride in a limousine with Ben, and in the morning they announced that they had become a couple. There was gossip at school, but the two lovers didn't care. They knew for sure that they would always be together. Ben graduated from law school and Maggie became a surgeon. A few years after graduation, they got married, and Maggie thought that she had pulled out a lucky ticket in life because her husband was the man whom she had loved since school age. The first 2 years of marriage were ideal. Ben and Maggie called each other at work 10 times a day, asking what interesting was happening, sharing events, thoughts, and feelings. They were like one whole, unable to imagine their lives without each other. Neighbors, a certain close couple, once asked Maggie about her relationship with her husband. "He is the best thing that happened to me in my entire life," Maggie answered enthusiastically and smiled dreamily. Sarah Close looked at her strangely, but said nothing. Maggie thought that the neighbor wanted to say something about Ben, but this did not happen. In the evening, when Ben arrived from work, he was greeted by a smiling Maggie. The couple kissed, after which Ben headed to the bedroom to change into his home clothes for dinner. Maggie served her husband the steak and salad with a joyful smile. Ben tried, and his face immediately turned grim. "What's the matter, dear?" Maggie was alarmed, and Ben, frowning even more, answered angrily. "Did you want to poison me? You call this food?" Maggie didn't understand anything. "But I always cooked steak like this for you, dear. You usually liked it." "It tasted better before," the husband answered harshly and pushed the plate away from him. "Who told you, Mag, that you can even eat this? I would be ashamed to even give such meat to a dog in case it gets poisoned." Mag sat down with a confused face. Seeing that his wife had fallen into complete confusion, Ben burst out laughing. "Maggie, what a fool you are! I was just joking, my dear. In fact, the steak is excellent. Try it. Even the best restaurant in the city won't serve this." "It was a joke?" Maggie asked, confused, and smiled ingratiatingly. "I even thought for a second you were being serious." "Well, how can I say such things seriously, my beauty?" Ben pretended to be offended. "Do you think so badly about me? I would never say anything like that about you. Don't even think about it." However, from that day on, Maggie doubted that she understood her husband correctly. He could say some harsh phrase and then pretend that Maggie herself misinterpreted his words. Maggie couldn't tell whether Ben was joking or serious, especially when he said something very offensive and unpleasant to her. "I've known for a long time that you're not a Christmas present in a festive package," Ben said one day. Why do I have the feeling that you are not telling me something? Darling, have you kept secrets from me?" "What secrets?" Maggie was perplexed. "Honey, I'm just tired. There have been so many patients lately that sometimes I can barely stand on my feet. Don't be offended that I don't want to talk." "You calmed me down." Ben looked mockingly at his wife. "I've already begun to fear that I have a handsome rival in the person of your colleague or even an ordinary janitor. You wouldn't stoop to that level, will you, my dear?" Maggie felt exhausted by such jokes. Although Ben did not outwardly show that he was ready to continue verbal sparring, the woman understood that he was playing his own game. A game which purpose Maggie did not understand, but realized that its results would have a direct impact on her life. Later, Maggie more than once reproached herself for not listening in time to her own intuition, which whispered to her, "Ben is not what you want him to be. Leave him before it's too late." But Maggie continued to believe that she and her husband were just having a temporary crisis in their relationship. Maggie also believed that she was to blame for Ben's emotional outbursts because he has a very sensitive nature. When an inner voice said to a woman, "What about you? Can a person who is indifferent to human pain and suffering work as a doctor?" Maggie preferred to pretend that this did not apply to her. Ben and Maggie had no children, which suited both of them quite well. Maggie was afraid that she would be a bad mother because she was completely immersed in work. Sometimes she thought that fate did not give her children because for her, the clinic where she worked was better than a family nest under the same roof with Ben. Then Maggie became ashamed of such thoughts and she began to intensively clean up the house, preparing for the arrival of her husband. Ben encouraged his wife's efforts around the house and said that only truly loving and worthy women would take such care of their beloved husband. Ben called women who shared housework with their husbands bitches and was glad that his Maggie was not like that. Maggie was pleased to hear that next to her, Ben felt like a real man and the head of the family. And this continued until Maggie was offered to become the chief surgeon. This meant not only a substantial increase in salary, but also many additional responsibilities. Maggie had much less free time, but Ben said that for the sake of their own future, they could endure some inconvenience. However, gradually, the man's face ceased to express his former joy. Ben began to grumble more often, saying that his wife should not work so much. "How will you have the strength to communicate with me if you disappear all day at work?" Ben was angry. "I come to an empty house where no one is waiting for me. If we had children, it would be just terrible. I imagine showing them your photo and saying, 'Look, baby, that's your mom.'" Maggie closed her eyes in horror. She, too, would not want her own children to recognize her only from a photograph. Maggie wanted to ask to be removed from this new position, but Mr. Ross, the manager and owner of the clinic, refused the woman. "Margaret, I simply have no one to appoint to this position. Only you have the competence to handle your responsibilities." Maggie was always shy when called by her full name. She nodded obediently and left the restroom. She decided to call her husband and say that they had just brought in a very problematic patient and she was now preparing for surgery. Ben listened to her dryly and said meaningfully, "Maybe you should kill this patient so that you won't operate again." "But then I'll go to jail and lose my doctor's license." Maggie was amazed. Ben just chuckled. "Even if so, what's the problem? I have already stopped hoping that someday you will meet me as before. Apparently a corpse is needed so that you stop pretending to be a great surgeon." Maggie realized it was time to end the conversation. Her teacher, Professor Davis, often said that no surgeon should begin an operation with chaos in his head. The surgeon's hands should not tremble. The eye must be precise and the motions must always be under control. If you can't control your own emotions, you have no business being in the operating room. "If I don't force myself to calm down, then the operation will have to be postponed," Maggie thought, turning off the phone. She understood that she was holding a human life in her hands. But what should she do if her own life has just crumbled into small fragments? Only now did Maggie realize that her beloved man, whose successes she was so proud of and for whom she was always happy more than for herself, agreed to see her in prison. He clearly thought it was a good idea, that it would be better for him if Maggie failed and lost the license she treasured so much. "This is not just a license," Maggie almost cried. "This is my work, my life. How will I look other people in the eyes if I intentionally kill the person who turned to me for help? I'll do what I have to do." Maggie decided. She performed the operation with special inspiration. The patient, whom they were afraid of losing, greeted her with a wide smile the next morning. "Thank you, miss," he said in a low, sonorous voice. The man smiled so much that Maggie for some time ceased to understand what was happening. It seemed to her that she was drowned in the gaze of a stranger. This pleasant but forgotten feeling excited Maggie for several hours. Arriving home, she found her husband there, angrily throwing Maggie's clothes all over the house. "Ben, what's going on here?" The woman turned to her husband. "Nothing special," he answered casually. "I'm just trying to understand when you managed to dismiss me." "What are you talking about?" Maggie asked tiredly. Ben immediately noticed her intonation. "I seem like a complete idiot to you, right?" he asked angrily and came closer to his wife. "It looks like there's something you don't understand, Maggie. You can't do this to me." "What do you mean by this?" Maggie began to get angry, but her words were interrupted by a blow. Ben slapped her with a resounding slap that sent Maggie's head ringing. She sat down on the floor and touched her face. Her cheek seemed to be on fire, and her eyes stopped seeing from tears. Ben, as if nothing had happened, brought a paper towel and said carefully, "Honey, wipe your face. You will swell, and who will you look like? It's better to wash your face with cold water than make yourself a herbal fabric mask for your face." Maggie, not really understanding anything, nodded in agreement and went to the bathroom. While washing her face, she saw the reflection of Ben's face in the mirror. He clearly enjoyed what he did. Frightened by his outburst, Maggie wanted to file a police report against her husband. However, there was a former cop there who convinced Maggie not to do it. "Understand, ma'am, I'm not trying to intimidate you. It's just that now the police have more important things to do than your family grievances. I dare to suggest that you could provoke each other into careless statements and actions, which, as I'm sure, you both will regret. Why would you rock the boat?" Maggie thought his words were reasonable, and she did not write a statement. The next morning, Ben asked her for forgiveness, and in the evening he brought an expensive necklace and a luxurious bouquet of roses. He seemed so sincere when he asked forgiveness for his intemperance that Maggie believed his words. However, a week later, Ben beat her again and made it look as if she herself had fallen and hit the steps of the stairs. Maggie began to fear her husband because he would strike without warning and then pretend that he had nothing to do with Maggie's injuries and bruises. "Honey, why are you so clumsy?" Ben wrinkled his nose, carrying his wife in his arms to their shared bedroom. "How do you manage to fall so much?" He seemed to enjoy feeling her trembling with fear in his arms. Every time Maggie ended up beaten if Ben even thought that she wanted to leave him or that she had a lover. After the beating, the man begged for forgiveness on his knees, and Maggie believed him again and again. One day they had a patient, from whose injuries Maggie realized that she was seeing a victim of domestic violence. And that woman, having come to her senses after the operation, admitted that her husband had been beating her for many years. "But I can't leave him," Rosemary cried quietly. "He said that he would find me wherever I hid from him. He will find and severely punish me. I'm too afraid of him." It was as if lightning flashed inside Maggie's head. She realized what awaited her if she continued to live with Ben. On the same day, the woman wrote a statement against her husband, accusing him of violence. When Ben was sentenced to prison, Maggie was able to breathe freely. She divorced him, changed her last name, and moved to another city, away from her ex-husband and his friends.